The document August Wallace slapped onto the table between them was not a contract. It was a verdict. Gertrude Merritt did not flinch when it landed. She did not reach for it with trembling hands or cast her eyes downward the way every other woman in Caldwell, Kansas had apparently done before her. She simply looked at it, then looked at him, and said, in a voice as level and unhurried as the prairie horizon behind his head, "I am not signing that." The saloon went quiet in the particular way that saloons go quiet when something more dangerous than a gunfight is happening. Men at the bar turned on their stools. The piano player let his fingers drift off the keys. Even the bartender, a broad-shouldered man named Percy who had seen enough violence to fill 3 lifetimes, paused with a whiskey glass suspended halfway to the shelf. August Wallace stood at the far end of the table with his arms crossed and his jaw set at the angle that had, according to every soul in Comanche County, preceded 14 different men backing down from 14 different confrontations. He was not a small man. He was not a gentle-looking man. He had the kind of face that had been arranged by weather and hard years into something that communicated, without words, that pleasantries were a waste of his time. Every woman who has come to this county looking for work at the W has signed that agreement, he said. It establishes terms. It protects the ranch's interests. It strips the worker of any legal recourse if you decide arbitrarily that they have failed to meet your satisfaction, Gertrude said, still not touching the document. I read it on the stage from Wichita 3 times. I have a good memory and an excellent understanding of contract law, Mr. Wallace, and what you are asking me to sign is not a protection. It is a trap. The word hung in the air like smoke. August Wallace uncrossed his arms. Something shifted in his expression. It was small, barely perceptible, the way a crack appears in a stone wall before you understand the entire foundation is moving. But Gertrude Merritt saw it because she had been watching for exactly that kind of thing her entire life, ever since she had learned, at the age of 9, that the men who held power over your circumstances were always most vulnerable in the first moment they realized you were not afraid of them. "Who told you to come here?" he said. "No one told me to come here," she said. "I read your advertisement in the Wichita Eagle. You need a bookkeeper and land recorder. I am the most qualified bookkeeper and land recorder within 300 miles. I came of my own volition, without recommendation or introduction, and I am prepared to begin work on Monday provided we negotiate a contract that is mutually fair. Good evening, Mr. Wallace." She picked up her traveling bag from the floor beside her chair, settled her hat, and walked out of the saloon into the darkening Kansas evening, leaving behind the document, the silence, and August Wallace standing at the end of that table with an expression that no one in Caldwell had ever seen on his face before. It was, unmistakably, delight. The summer of 1882 had arrived in Comanche County, the way it always arrived, without apology and without mercy, baking the red clay roads into something that cracked underfoot and pulling the color out of the sky until it was a washed-out blue that reminded older settlers of faded calico. The W Ranch spread across 11,000 acres of mixed-grass prairie south of Caldwell, and it had been August Wallace's inheritance, his burden, his purpose, and his obsession for 31 of his 34 years on Earth. His father, Howard Wallace, had built the W from a single claim and a borrowed team of horses, and he had built it the way men of his era built things, through relentless labor, a certain tolerance for other people's suffering that he never examined too closely, and a gift for recognizing opportunity in circumstances that destroyed lesser men. Howard Wallace had died in the winter of 1879, leaving the ranch to August and a set of debts to the First Bank of Wichita that had taken August 2 brutal years to clear. He had cleared them. He had expanded the herd. He had negotiated a cattle contract with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway that gave the W a preferential shipping rate and made August Wallace, at 34, one of the wealthiest landowners in southern Kansas. He had also, in the process, developed a reputation for being the most difficult employer in the territory. It was not entirely unearned. August Wallace had standards that he had never been successfully able to explain to other human beings because they lived inside him at a level below language, a bone-deep certainty about how things ought to be done, how accounts ought to be kept, how land ought to be recorded and managed, how a ranch of this size and complexity ought to be administered. He had hired 7 bookkeepers in 3 years. He had let all 7 go within 2 months. The first had made arithmetic errors. The second had been falsifying expense records. The third, fourth, and fifth had been competent but incurious, which was, in August's private taxonomy, almost worse than incompetent. The sixth had been genuinely excellent but had quit after 6 weeks, leaving a note that said, simply, "You are exhausting." The seventh had never even made it through the first day. The advertisement he had placed in the Wichita Eagle had been his last, best hope, and he had written it with the grim efficiency of a man who no longer expected to be surprised by anything. He was wrong about that. Gertrude Merritt had read that advertisement on a Tuesday morning in the back room of the Wichita law office, where she worked as an assistant to a solicitor named Bernard Oakes, a decent man who paid her half what her work was worth, and had been gently, persistently explaining to her for 2 years that her intelligence was not in question, only her prospects. She had been 26 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher from Lawrence, Kansas, and a surveyor who had died of a fever when she was 12, leaving her mother with 4 children and a fierce, pragmatic determination to educate all of them as thoroughly as possible regardless of their sex. Gertrude had attended the Kansas State Normal School at Emporia for 2 years before money ran out. She had taught herself contract law from the law books on Bernard Oakes' shelves. She had a mind that moved quickly and laterally, that found patterns in numbers and inconsistencies in documents the way other people found familiar faces in crowds, immediately and without effort. She had also, by the summer of 1882, developed a fatigue with the quiet, persistent architecture of diminishment that defined her working life in Wichita. The half wages, the gentle explanations, the invisible ceiling that she kept bumping her head against in an office where she did the best work and received the least recognition. Before she left for Caldwell, she had mentioned August Wallace's advertisement to Harriet Oakes, Bernard's wife, who was a sociable woman with connections across the territory. Harriet had gone very still. "Gertrude," she had said, with the careful gentleness of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis, "every woman who has applied for that position has come back saying the man is impossible." He dismissed the last one before she even unpacked her desk. "They say he has standards no human being can meet, and the disposition of a man who has never in his life been told something he wanted to hear." "Good," Gertrude had said, and had gone to pack. She was not going to Caldwell to please August Wallace. She was not going to Caldwell to perform patience or deference or the particular brand of professional cheerfulness that the world seemed to expect from women in working situations. She was going to Caldwell because she was the best bookkeeper and land recorder in 300 miles, and she intended to do excellent work and be paid a fair wage for it. And if August Wallace had a problem with that, she would say so directly. She had arrived on the Thursday afternoon stage, which deposited her in front of the Caldwell Hotel with her 2 traveling bags and her carpetbag full of ledger books and reference materials, and she had spent the first 2 hours reading the contract that had been left for her at the front desk, with a note saying that it required her signature before she could be considered for the position. She had read it 3 times, as she had told August Wallace. She was not wrong about what it said. The contract required her to accept, without appeal, any determination August Wallace made about the quality of her work. It contained a clause that allowed him to reclaim her wages for any week he deemed her performance unsatisfactory. It prohibited her from discussing the terms of her employment with any other person in the county. It was not a work agreement. It was a document designed to produce complete submission or immediate departure, and Gertrude suspected that for August Wallace, the latter outcome had become acceptable, perhaps even preferable. She had carried the unsigned document to the saloon where she had been told he could be found on Thursday evenings, and she had put it back on the table in front of him. In the days that followed that first evening, Gertrude settled into the Caldwell Hotel and waited. She did not call at the Double W, she did not send a message. She did not adjust her position or soften her stance or do any of the things that the situation seemed to require of her. She had her own work with her, columns of numbers from Bernard Oak's office that she had promised to complete before her departure became official, and she sat at the small desk in her hotel room and worked on them in the mornings and walked the town in the afternoons and formed her own impressions of Caldwell without anyone's assistance. Caldwell in 1882 was a cattle town in the full, complicated, contradictory meaning of that phrase. It sat at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, which meant it existed at the intersection of American ambition and the forced displacement of the Cherokee, Osage, and other nations who had been relocated to Indian Territory just across the Kansas border to the south. The town had money and violence and aspiration all running together the way creek water runs together in spring, too fast to separate. The cattle drives from Texas came up the Kishom Trail and ended here, and the drovers arrived trail-worn and reckless, and the saloons did their business, and then summer would tip into autumn, and the trail would close, and the town would become something quieter and stranger, a place holding its breath until the next season. Gertrude found she liked Caldwell despite all this, or perhaps because of all this. She liked its energy and its contradiction. She liked that it asked nothing of her because it was too busy asking things of everyone else. On the third day, she was sitting in the hotel dining room at breakfast when August Wallace walked in. He did not look like a man who had come to negotiate. He looked like a man who had come to deliver a verdict of his own. He was wearing the same kind of clothes she had seen him in at the saloon, plain working clothes, dark trousers, a linen shirt, a hat that had been good once and was now simply useful, and he moved through the dining room with the practiced economy of someone who had never learned to waste motion. He sat down across from her without being invited. She poured herself more coffee and waited. "The contract is non-negotiable," he said. "Then we have nothing to discuss," she said. "Why not?" he said. It was such a genuinely curious question that she looked up from her coffee. Not hostile, not rhetorical. He actually wanted to know why she found it objectionable, in the manner of a man who had never had the objection explained to him. "Because it gives you unchecked authority to determine the value of my labor after I have performed it," she said. "Which means I could work 6 months of excellent work, and you could decide at any moment that you are unsatisfied and reclaim the wages. No rational person would accept those terms." 6 previous bookkeepers accepted those terms, he said, and you let all 6 of them go, she said. So the contract worked perfectly in the way you intended, which was to ensure that anyone who took the position had already surrendered their dignity before they started. That tells me a great deal about what happened after they arrived. The dining room was not as quiet as the saloon had been, but the 2 people at the nearest table had gone very still over their eggs. August Wallace looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were an unusual color, a kind of gray-green that changed quality with the light, and they were, she noticed, extremely attentive. He was not a man who looked at things without seeing them. "What terms would you accept?" he said. "A flat monthly wage negotiated in advance," she said. "A clear written description of my duties. A provision that if you find my work unsatisfactory, you give me 10 days written notice with specific explanation of the deficiency, during which time I have the opportunity to address it, and complete freedom to discuss the terms of my employment with anyone I choose." "That last one is unnecessary," he said. "That last one is the most important one," she said. Anyone who requires secrecy around employment terms has something to hide about those terms. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, which was interesting. He did not perform thinking. He simply did it, going somewhere interior and apparently consulting something there, and then he came back. "Monday morning," he said, 7 o'clock. "Bring your own reference materials. I'll have a revised agreement ready." He stood, settled his hat, and left. Gertrude finished her coffee and permitted herself a small, private sense of satisfaction. She rode out to the Double W on Monday morning on a horse she rented from the livery stable, which immediately told August Wallace something about her, because every previous bookkeeper had arrived by wagon or by asking one of his ranch hands to fetch them. The fact that she came on horseback, alone, arriving exactly at 7 with dust on her boots and no expression suggesting she found any of this remarkable, recalibrated something in his assessment of her before she had even dismounted. He had the revised agreement ready. She read it at the kitchen table of the ranch house while he stood at the window with his coffee, and she made 2 minor corrections with a pencil she produced from her bag, and then she signed it, and he signed it, and they were, technically, in a professional arrangement. The ranch house was large and somewhat chaotic in the administrative sense. August Wallace was an excellent rancher and a mediocre record keeper, which he acknowledged without particular embarrassment. The accounts were accurate but disorganized. The land records were a 3-year accumulation of surveys, deeds, boundary agreements, and grazing rights documentation that had been filed by a system that seemed to be based entirely on which pile was nearest when the document needed to be put somewhere. There were also outstanding disputes with 2 neighboring ranchers about fence lines that had never been properly resolved, because no one had done the underlying survey work to establish the legal boundaries. Gertrude looked at all of this and felt, for the first time in several years, genuinely interested in a working problem. She established her workspace at a large table in the back room of the ranch house that had been used mostly for storage. She organized the accounts first because they were the most pressing, working through 3 years of ledgers with a methodical focus that she found meditative in the good way, the way that absorption in a difficult problem is meditative. She found 2 arithmetic errors and 1 bookkeeping irregularity that suggested the previous bookkeeper had been padding the feed supply invoices modestly but consistently. She documented all 3 findings and left the documentation on August Wallace's desk without comment. He came to find her at the end of the first day. "The feed supplier discrepancy," he said. "You're sure?" "The numbers are in the document," she said. "Check them yourself if you want." "I will," he said, and then after a pause, "The errors are mine. I missed them." "I know," she said. "You were managing a great deal. It would have been easy to miss." He seemed slightly surprised by this, as if he had expected her to either dismiss the acknowledgement or amplify it into something complicated. "Anything else?" he said. "Not today," she said. "Ask me again on Friday." He left. She went back to her work. This became their rhythm, not a warm one initially, not unfriendly either. It was the rhythm of 2 people who were both primarily interested in the work in front of them, and who found, gradually and without making a production of it, that the other person was genuinely good at what they did. August Wallace was, Gertrude discovered, not difficult in the way she had been warned. He was demanding in the way that a person who cares intensely about excellence is demanding, which is a different thing entirely. He wanted things done correctly. He wanted problems identified honestly rather than concealed for convenience. He wanted to understand the numbers behind every decision, not just the summary. These were not unreasonable standards. They were, in fact, the standards of a man who was deeply invested in the survival of something he had built and maintained at great personal cost. What he was not good at was communicating any of this to the people who worked for him. He had, she suspected, never learned that what lived inside his head as a clear expectation arrived in the external world as an incomprehensible demand. He said things like, "The Eastern Section records are wrong," without specifying what was wrong or how they should be corrected. He implied dissatisfaction without articulating it. He expected people to understand what he needed without him having to say it, and when they did not, he concluded they were inadequate rather than recognizing that he had failed to explain himself. Gertrude did not accommodate this pattern. When he said something imprecise, she asked him to be more specific. When he implied a problem, she asked him to name it. She did this without aggression but with complete consistency, and after the first 2 weeks, she noticed that he had started being more precise before she asked, as if her habit of requiring clarity had begun to shape his habit of communicating. She was not sure he was aware of it. She was intensely aware of it, in the way that she was intensely aware of him generally, which was a fact she had decided to be honest with herself about while also deciding that it was not relevant to her professional purpose and therefore did not require action. He was a striking man, not in a conventional or decorative sense. He was striking the way that certain landscapes are striking, the high plains at dawn, a thunderhead building on the horizon, the way the grasslands move in a strong wind, all at once and in the same direction. There was a quality of coherence to him, of being completely and uncomplicatedly himself, that Gertrude found unexpectedly compelling after years of watching people perform versions of themselves for the benefit of others. August Wallace did not perform anything. He was direct to the point of discomfort. He said what he thought. He did what he said he would do. He had opinions and he stated them clearly, and he was not offended when you disagreed. He just made you prove it. At the end of her second week, she proved it. She had been working through the land records and had identified a solution to the fence line disputes that involved a resurvey of 3 boundary sections and a negotiated easement that would actually benefit both neighboring ranchers, a man named Cole Bassett and a man named Irvin Farr, while clarifying the Double W's legal position. She had prepared a written proposal with the survey methodology, the legal precedent, and a cost estimate. August read it at his desk while she stood by the window, and she watched him read it with the particular attention of someone waiting to see if a conclusion they have reached will survive contact with another intelligent person's scrutiny. "This would work," he said, which was the closest thing to unqualified praise she had yet heard from him. "I know," she said. He looked up. "You're not modest," he said. "I'm accurate," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Modesty would require me to say it might work and defer to your judgment. But I've done the legal research and the surveying methodology is sound. Saying it would work is not arrogance, it's honesty." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the distinct sense he was doing something careful and interior, fitting this piece of information about her alongside other pieces he had collected, assembling something. "Send the proposal to Bassett and Farr," he said. "Copy me?" "I'll need the ranch letterhead," she said. "Bottom drawer of the filing cabinet," he said. "You can use it." It was a small thing. It was also, she understood, a significant thing. He had never in the history of the Double W given anyone other than himself the authority to use the ranch's official communication materials. She took the letterhead without making anything of it and went back to her workspace. The proposals went out that week. Cole Bassett responded within 3 days with a cautious but interested reply. Irvin Farr took 2 weeks, but his response was substantively positive. By the end of August, a formal meeting had been arranged to negotiate the terms of the resurvey, and Gertrude found herself sitting at a table with August Wallace and 2 neighboring ranchers, guiding the conversation with a precision and patience that had both Bassett and Farr agreeing to terms before the afternoon was over. On the ride back to the Double W, August was quiet for a long time. The sun was going down over the flat western horizon, and the light was doing what it did at this hour on the Kansas prairie, turning everything amber and gold, and making even the most ordinary landscape look briefly like something sacred. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that?" he said. "Bernard Oak's office in Wichita," she said. He let me observe depositions and contract negotiations. I have a good memory for what works and what doesn't. He let you observe, August said. You weren't involved. I was an assistant, she said. I prepared documents, organized records, and occasionally offered analysis that was attributed to Mr. Oakes in client meetings because clients were not comfortable receiving legal analysis from a woman. She said it flatly, without bitterness and without performance, the way you state a fact about weather. It was true. It was unjust. Both things were equally true, and she had long since stopped spending energy on the injustice that she could be spending on the work. August Wallace said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's a significant waste." "Yes," she agreed. "I don't do that," he said. "I know," she said. "It's one of the reasons I'm still here." Another silence, different in quality from the first. She was aware of the horse moving under her, and the cooling air, and the vast open sky, and the man riding beside her. And she was aware that something between them was shifting in a way that she could not precisely name, and was not sure she should try to name. "The work on the Eastern land records," August said finally, returning as he always did to the concrete and the actionable. "How long will it take to complete?" "Another 3 weeks if nothing interrupts," she said. 2 weeks if you can give me the survey maps from 1876 that you mentioned were in storage." "I'll find them," he said. "Thank you," she said. They rode the rest of the way in silence that was, by some accumulation of small things, comfortable. The survey maps were on her desk the next morning. September brought a change in the weather that the whole county felt like a physical presence. The heat broke gradually, the mornings turning cool while the afternoons still carried summer in them, and the ranch entered the intense pre-autumn work period that August had warned her about when they first established her duties. The cattle drives were finishing for the season, and the accounting work expanded considerably, and Gertrude found herself arriving at the ranch before 7 and often staying until the light was gone. She did not mind this. The work was genuinely interesting, and the ranch was a more comfortable place to be than the hotel, and she had, by this point, developed a working relationship with some of the other people on the Double W that she valued. There was a woman named Josephine, who managed the domestic side of the ranch house, and who had the particular quality of sharpness wrapped in warmth that Gertrude found in other capable women, who had learned to survive in narrow circumstances. There was a head drover named Thomas Bright, a black man from Texas who had come up the trail 3 consecutive years and had stayed on the Double W as a permanent employee after the 3rd, and who was as genuinely skilled at his work as anyone Gertrude had ever observed. Thomas and she developed an unexpected alliance over the account books because the expense records for the drive operations were his domain in practice if not in title, and he had kept them in his own shorthand system that was, once she decoded it, more efficient than the formal ledger system she had inherited. She adopted elements of it. He noticed and said nothing, but she caught him looking at the new ledger format once with an expression of quiet satisfaction. She mentioned all of this to August one evening, the value of Thomas Bright's record-keeping instincts, his organizational intelligence, the fact that his informal system had caught 2 discrepancies that the formal system had missed. August was quiet for a moment after she finished. "Thomas has been here 3 years," he said. "I knew he was excellent at the driving operation. I didn't know about the records." "He probably didn't tell you because he didn't know if you'd want to hear it," she said carefully. August looked at her. "Because I'm difficult to talk to. Because you're specific about authority," she said. "And people learn over time to stay within the lines of what they've been given. It's not a criticism, it's an observation about how structures work." He turned this over. She could see him doing it. "I'll talk to Thomas," he said. She did not ask what came of that conversation, but 2 weeks later, Thomas Bright received a formal increase in responsibilities and a corresponding increase in pay, and he came to find Gertrude in her workspace that afternoon with an expression of contained, dignified pleasure that told her everything she needed to know. October arrived, and with it the first cold wind from the north, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythm, slower and more internal. The cattle work reduced. The accounts shifted toward the year-end reconciliation that Gertrude had been preparing for since August, and the long evenings in the ranch house became a thing that happened naturally, and without anyone deciding they would happen. She stayed late one Thursday finishing the land record documentation, and when she came through to the main room to get her coat, August was at the large fireplace with a cup of coffee and a survey map spread across the table, and the darkness outside and the warmth inside created a domestic quality to the scene that she registered and then deliberately did not react to. He looked up. "I thought you'd gone." "The eastern boundary documentation," she said. "I wanted to finish it." "Sit down," he said. "Have coffee if you want. It's too dark to ride back tonight." She looked at the window and he was right. The sun had gone completely. The Kansas November darkness was total outside the glass. "I'll take the coffee," she said and sat. They were quiet for a while, each with their own work, and the fire did its work and the wind moved outside, and there was in that hour a quality of simple, unremarkable comfort that Gertrude had not felt in a professional or personal setting in some years. The feeling of being in the right place with a person who was not asking her to be anything other than what she was. "Gertrude," August said. She looked up. He seemed to be deciding something, looking at the fire rather than at her. In the firelight, his face had lost some of its characteristic economy. He looked almost uncertain, which was so far from his usual expression that it reconfigured the whole architecture of his face into something more accessible. "When you came here," he said, "I had already decided that whoever came next was the last person I was going to hire for this position. I was going to find someone tolerable, or I was going to manage the records myself." "I understand," she said. "I'm telling you," he said, turning to look at her now, "that I had already built the expectation of failure into the arrangement. And I want you to know that I recognize that was not a fair circumstance to put someone into." She held his gaze. It was a meaningful thing to say, and he had said it with the same directness he brought to everything, without decoration or deflection. "I didn't come here expecting fairness," she said. "I came here expecting to do good work. Fairness was something I was going to require once I demonstrated the work." "Yes," he said, "I noticed that. Did it bother you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said. It was the first time in 3 years that someone walked into this ranch and behaved like they had nothing to prove. "Everyone else came trying to please me. You came trying to do the work." It's a completely different thing, and it made me realize I had somehow constructed a situation where people were more focused on my reaction than on the job. "That tends to happen," she said, "when you hold all the power and there are no structural protections for the people who work for you. Like a contract without appeal provisions," he said. "Exactly like that," she said. He poured more coffee for both of them without asking, which she noticed, and the fire settled in the grate with a sound like a held breath finally released. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer honestly, which I think you will regardless of what I ask." "Probably," she said. "What do you want? Not from this position. I mean from your life. What is it that you are building toward?" It was such an unexpected question, so direct and so genuinely interested, that for a moment she was simply struck by it. No one had asked her this. Not Bernard Oakes, not her mother in any meaningful way, not any of the men who had briefly been interested in her in Wichita before her unwillingness to perform smallness on their behalf had made the interest fade. No one had asked her what she was building toward as if it were an obvious, natural question with a real answer worth hearing. "I want to do work that uses everything I have," she said. "I want to be paid fairly for it. I want to have enough security that I am never dependent on someone else's goodwill for my survival. And I want, eventually, a partnership with someone who finds my intelligence an asset rather than a complication." The last part she had not precisely intended to say aloud, but it came out with the rest of it because he had asked for honesty and she had meant to give it. August set down his coffee cup. "I find your intelligence the most useful thing that has happened to this ranch in 3 years," he said. "That's professional," she said. "It is," he agreed. "It is not exclusively professional." The fire was the only sound for a moment. "August," she said. "Yes." "I did not come here to become romantically involved with my employer," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I understand," he said. "I also did not intend to become personally interested in an employee. It seems to have happened without my planning for it." "What are you proposing to do about it?" she said. "Nothing precipitous," he said. "I have a history of behaving precipitously, and it has not served me well. I am proposing to tell you honestly that I am personally interested in you, and to ask whether that is something you wish to know." She thought about this. The fire, the wind. His face in the light, steady and direct and carrying something that she recognized, having looked for it a long time in places it had not been, as genuine regard. "Yes," she said. "I wish to know it." He nodded once as if an agreement had been reached. Then he picked his survey map back up and returned to studying it, and she picked up her coffee, and they sat in the warmth of that large room with the winter dark pressing against the windows, and nothing further was said, and it was, in its own way, more intimate than anything that had ever been said to her. She rode back to the Caldwell Hotel in the cold dark on the good horse from the livery, and she did not examine what she was feeling with too much precision because she had a practical nature, and she understood that some things needed time to be what they were going to be. In the weeks that followed, the quality of their working relationship remained unchanged in its professional aspects and changed in every other way. He asked her opinions on things outside the accounts. She offered them. They disagreed frequently, and neither of them found this uncomfortable. He had strong convictions about land management and water rights and the future of the cattle industry in Kansas, and she had clear views about labor practices and legal structures and the economic patterns she could see in the numbers she managed, and their conversations ranged over all of it with a directness and mutual attention that she found consistently exhilarating. He made her laugh once in November, unexpectedly, with a dry, precise observation about a letter they had received from the railway company that was so exactly right about the self-important opacity of institutional communication that she was laughing before she had finished the sentence, and he looked at her with an expression of such undisguised pleasure at having produced this effect that she had to look away. She found him, increasingly, watching her, not in the manner of assessment or surveillance, in the manner of someone who is interested in what a particular person will do next, and finds the answer consistently more interesting than anticipated. She knew because she was doing the same thing. Josephine noticed. Josephine noticed everything and made no remarks about it, but she began, subtly, to ensure that when the household had supper in the evenings, Gertrude was included without it being made into a particular occasion, and that the good coffee was made on the evenings she stayed late rather than the ordinary coffee, and that the fire in the back room was stoked properly on cold mornings before Gertrude arrived. Thomas Bright noticed also, and what he did about it was tell Gertrude, during a conversation about the spring drive planning, that August Wallace had not laughed out loud in the 3 years Thomas had known him until recently, and that he himself found this development encouraging. November became December, and December brought real cold, the kind that comes off the northern plain without qualification, and Gertrude had been planning to return to Wichita for Christmas, but when the time came she found she did not want to go. She wrote to her mother and her sister and her brothers, and explained that the work was at a critical stage, which was true, and that she would visit in spring, which she fully intended. On Christmas Eve, the Double W held what Josephine called a modest gathering, and what turned out to be a considerable number of ranch hands and their families, and several people from town, all filling the large main room of the ranch house with firelight and fiddle music and the smell of Josephine's cooking, which was extraordinary. August found Gertrude standing near the windows with a cup of punch, looking out at the snow-covered prairie in the moonlight, which was a sight that stopped the breath if you let it. "You stayed," he said. "The work," she said. "Yes," he said, in the particular tone he used when he was agreeing with the surface of a thing while acknowledging the depth of it. They stood together by the windows, and the fiddle played something slow, and the snow reflected the moonlight and made the whole world outside silver and still. "I am not good at this," he said quietly. "At what?" "At saying what I mean when what I mean is personal rather than practical," he said. "I can discuss accounts and land surveys and legal precedent without any difficulty. I find this other thing considerably harder." "Say it practically then," she said. "You're good at that." A brief pause, the fiddle, the snow. "I would like to court you," he said, "formally and properly and with full transparency about my intentions, which are serious." She turned to look at him. His expression was set in the way it always was when he had committed to a position, clear and a little braced, as if he was prepared for contradiction but not going to change course because of it. "My intentions are also serious," she said. "If we do this, we do it as equals. The working arrangement stays what it is. The personal arrangement is separate and handled honestly." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. "Most men would," she said. "I'm not most men," he said, with such plain, factual conviction that she believed him completely. "No," she said, "you are not." The fiddle shifted into something livelier, and somewhere behind them, Josephine was laughing at something, and the ranch house was full of warmth and sound, and Gertrude Merritt stood in the winter moonlight with August Wallace and felt, with the certainty she usually reserved for numbers that balanced perfectly, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The months that followed were not without complication, because nothing that was real and valuable was ever without complication, and both Gertrude and August were people of sufficiently strong character that their relationship contained genuine friction alongside genuine connection. In January, there was a significant disagreement about the spring cattle contract. August had a long-standing arrangement with a buyer named Harlan Price, who had been taking Double W cattle for 5 years, and Gertrude, having reviewed 3 years of accounts, had found evidence that Price had been consistently underweighting the cattle on delivery and pocketing the difference. The pattern was clear in the numbers. The discrepancy was not enormous in any single transaction, but across 3 years it was substantial. August received this information in silence, and she understood it was difficult not just because of the financial loss, but because Harlan Price had been a business associate he trusted, and discovering that trust had been misplaced was a particular kind of injury for a man whose trust was not easily given. "You're certain," he said. "The numbers are certain," she said. "I can show you the calculation." "Show me." She showed him. He sat with it for a long time, and she did not rush him and did not offer comfort she did not mean, and eventually he said, "I'll address it," and she said, "I know you will," and that was all that needed to be said. He addressed it. Harlan Price was confronted with the evidence and did not deny it for long. The arrangement was terminated and a partial repayment was negotiated under threat of formal legal complaint. August handled all of it with the same directness he brought to everything. No drama, no extended anger, just a clear accounting of the harm and a requirement for remedy. What he said to Gertrude afterward was, "I should have seen it. You saw it in 3 months. You were managing the whole ranch," she said. "I was looking specifically at the numbers." "You gave me an out," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "I wasn't giving you an out," she said. "I was being accurate about the structural difference between the work I do and the work you do. It genuinely is different." He looked at her. "You do that consistently," he said. "Do what?" "Offer the charitable interpretation as the accurate one." "When it's true," she said. "Is it always true?" "No," she said. "But with you it generally is. You're not careless. You were overstretched and undertooled. Those are different problems." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very simply, "Thank you, Gertrude." And the way he said her name in that moment, with that particular quiet weight, did something to her chest that she decided to stop pretending was professionally neutral. February brought a storm that pinned the whole ranch indoors for 3 days, and those 3 days were the ones in which the rest of the distance between them collapsed, not precipitously, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated hours of enforced proximity and unstructured conversation. They talked about everything. About his father and the history of the ranch, and the particular loneliness of inheriting something enormous that everyone assumed was straightforward joy. About her mother and the years after her father died, and the education that her mother had insisted on, with a fierceness that came from understanding exactly what the world would otherwise do to her daughters. About the future of the territory and the cattle industry, and the complicated, troubling reality of the displacement that had made the land available for ranching, which was something August had thought about more than she had expected, and about which he had no comfortable resolution. "There is no comfortable resolution," she said. "But thinking about it honestly is better than not thinking about it." "My father didn't think about it," August said. "I don't know if he could. It would have undone too much of what he had built his identity on." "And you?" "I think about it," he said. "I don't know what to do with it. I own the land. I can't unown it. I can try to be thoughtful about what I do with it." "That's not nothing," she said. "It doesn't feel like enough," he said. "A lot of important things don't feel like enough," she said. "You do them anyway." On the second evening of the storm, they were sitting at the fireplace, and the wind was something extraordinary outside, a howling sustained force that made the whole building feel like a ship. And August said with no preamble, "I love you." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and direct and not even slightly flinching from it. "I know," she said. "I love you as well." "You're not surprised," he said. "No," she said. "Are you?" "No," he said. "I'm relieved." "Why relieved?" "Because I was not entirely sure," he said, "that you would say it back. You do not say things you don't mean, and I wanted to know." "I do not say things I don't mean," she agreed, "which is how you can trust it." He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and the storm continued for another night and another day, and neither of them minded. By spring of 1883, the changes on the Double W were visible to everyone who had known it before. The accounts were clean and organized to a standard that saved August considerable time and allowed him to make decisions with a speed and confidence that had been impossible when the information he needed was buried in disorganized stacks. The land disputes were fully resolved, the boundaries surveyed and legally recorded. The new cattle contract, negotiated with a buyer from Kansas City that Gertrude had identified through the railway contacts she had developed, was 12% more favorable than the price arrangement had ever been at its most honest. Thomas Bright had been formally given the title and pay of ranch operations manager, and had in return organized the spring drive with an efficiency that had every drover on the Double W speaking well of the changes. Josephine had been given, at Gertrude's suggestion and August's immediate agreement, a formal household management contract that gave her real authority and fair compensation for work she had been doing informally for years. These were not small things. They were changes that moved through the whole structure of the ranch like water through soil, quietly and deeply, making things more solid. In April, August asked Gertrude to marry him. He did it in the back room where she worked in the middle of the morning, with no ceremony except the clear intent in his face when he appeared in the doorway with his hat in his hands and asked if she had a moment. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, before he had finished asking. "I haven't asked yet," he said. "You were going to ask me to marry you," she said. "The answer is yes." He was quiet for a moment, then very quietly he laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and helpless and surprised at itself, and it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard from him. "Gertrude," he said, still laughing slightly. "August," she said, smiling. "Will you marry me?" he said, formally and completely. "Yes," she said, formally and completely. He came into the room and she stood, and he held her face in both his hands and looked at her with an expression that had nothing reserved in it at all, everything he felt entirely visible, and he said very quietly, "I was told that no one could do this job. I nearly stopped expecting anyone could. I did not come here for you, she said. I came for the work. I know, he said. That is exactly why this worked. He kissed her. She kissed him back. Through the window, the April prairie was turning green with the first real warmth of the year, and somewhere across the flat horizon, a meadowlark was making the argument that the world was good. They were married in June of 1883 in the Caldwell Methodist Church, a plain building that was full to overflowing because the double W and the Wallace name had a presence in the county that filled rooms regardless of the occasion. Gertrude's mother came from Lawrence with her sister Clara and her two brothers, Emmett and Robert, and they all met August Wallace in the way families meet the man who is going to marry the person they love best, with a combination of hope and scrutiny. August passed the scrutiny because he did not try to charm anyone. He shook Emmett's hand and talked with him about the cattle market. He talked with Robert about the legal dimensions of the land record work. He sat with Gertrude's mother for half an hour in the hotel sitting room the day before the wedding, and said, among other things, that her daughter was the most intellectually capable person he had encountered in his professional life, and that he had no intention of curtailing any aspect of her work or independence. Gertrude's mother, who was a woman of considerable discernment, reported afterward that she found him entirely satisfactory, which from her was equivalent to most people's highest praise. Josephine organized the wedding supper with the same magnificent competence she brought to everything, and Thomas Bright gave a brief toast that was so precise and warm about both of them that it produced tears in people who had not come expecting to feel anything. The fiddle played. The evening went long. The summer stars over the Kansas prairie were extraordinary, the way they always were far from the city lights, the whole sky a presence rather than a backdrop. Gertrude and August left the party late and rode back to the Double W under that sky, and there was no need for many words because they had been saying things to each other, in the language they had developed together over a year of honest work and honest feeling, the whole time. The first year of their marriage was, in many ways, the best working year the Double W had ever had. The spring drive was the most profitable in the ranch's history. The land records were now organized to a standard that had attracted the attention of the county land office, which had asked Gertrude, through proper channels, if she would be willing to consult on the development of a county-wide recording system. She had discussed it with August, not to ask his permission, but because it affected both of them, and he had said immediately that she should do it if she wanted to, and that the ranch could manage without her for the days the consulting required. She did it. The county recording system she helped design became the model for 3 subsequent counties. The territorial government noticed. She received correspondence from the state capital that surprised her in its formality and its seriousness. August read the letters with an expression of contained pride that he then immediately converted into practical discussion. "You should go to Topeka for the meeting," he said. "It's 2 weeks," she said. "I know," he said. "The ranch will be here when you get back. I will be here when you get back. Go." She went. The meetings in Topeka were the first time she had been in a room of professional men as an acknowledged equal rather than an assistant, and the experience was one she turned over for years afterward, the quality of being fully seen in her professional capacity, heard, challenged, and credited. She came home with a formal consulting appointment that carried a modest but real fee, and the knowledge that her work had a reach beyond the Double W. August was waiting on the porch when she rode up, and he did not make a production of it, just stood and looked at her with the same steady, open regard that had been one of the first things she had trusted about him. "How was it?" he said. "Extraordinary," she said. "Tell me everything," he said, and she did, sitting on the porch in the September evening, and he listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and without the impatience that most people brought to other people's stories. And when she finished, he said, "You are going to remake the way this territory manages land documentation." And she said, "Probably not by myself." And he said, "No, not by yourself." With a great deal of support from people who recognize excellent work. and she looked at him and understood that he was including himself in that company and felt, again, the clean pleasure of being understood precisely. Their first child arrived in the spring of 1884, a boy they named Howard Arthur Wallace, Howard for August's father in the complicated, loving way that we name children for people we have complicated feelings about, and Arthur for Gertrude's grandfather. He arrived in April with red hair and his mother's eyes, and a set of opinions about the world that he communicated with great volume from the first hour. August held his son in the first morning and looked at him with an expression that was nothing like the economy of his usual face, all of it open, a little overwhelmed, simply and completely moved. "He looks angry," August said. "He's not angry," Gertrude said from the bed. "He has strong opinions. He's 8 hours old. Some people arrive knowing what they think," she said. August looked at her over the red head of their son. "Like his mother," he said. "Like his mother," she agreed. Howard grew into his strong opinions, and by 2 years old was a compact, willful, cheerful presence on the Double W, who had the undivided adoration of every ranch hand and Josephine's complete indulgence, and August's patient, amused attention. He followed his father everywhere on the ranch and asked questions incessantly, and August, who had not been a man of many words before, found that he became considerably more verbose in the presence of a small person who genuinely wanted to know why everything was the way it was. Gertrude watched this with a pleasure that was one of the best pleasures of her life. The consulting work grew. By 1885, she had a small formal practice in land recording and contract documentation that she ran primarily by correspondence and occasional travel, and she had trained 2 younger women in Topeka in the methodology, which was its own kind of satisfaction, the satisfaction of reproduction, of passing on. August occasionally joined her on the trips to Topeka when the timing allowed, and those journeys had a quality she treasured, the 2 of them moving through the larger world together, each competent and interested in each other's competence. There was a difficulty in 1885 that had to be navigated. A man named Gerald Slocum, who had purchased a section of land adjacent to the Double W from the estate of a rancher who had died the previous year, arrived in Comanche County with papers that he claimed established his right to a water source on the southeast boundary that the Double W had been using for 4 years. The claim was aggressive, and his legal representation was expensive, and the underlying documents were complex enough that it was not immediately clear who was right. Gertrude spent 3 weeks doing nothing but researching the legal history of that water source. The work was painstaking and sometimes required correspondence with the Territorial Land Office and the original surveying company and 2 different law libraries. She found, eventually, the chain of documentation that proved the water rights had been granted to the original Double W claim in 1871 and had never been legally transferred regardless of what Slocum's papers implied. She prepared a full legal brief and presented it first to August, then to the county judge. Slocum's claim was dismissed. But what had been more difficult than the legal work was managing August's impulse, in the weeks before the resolution, to handle the dispute through the kind of direct physical confrontation that the West still offered as an option. Slocum had been aggressive in his approach, and had twice ridden onto Double W land without permission, and had had one exchange with August near the eastern fence line that had been tense in the way that exchanges between determined men in isolated territory could be tense. "I need you to let me handle this through legal channels," she had said to August one evening when the tension was high. "He's on our land," August said. "And I can prove it in a way that closes this permanently," she said. "Confrontation closes nothing, it just rearranges who has the grievance." He had looked at her for a long moment. The muscle in his jaw worked. "I know you're right," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm asking you to act on it." He did. It cost him something. She knew that. Cost him against the grain of his instincts, and the instincts of every man who had built something with his hands and defended it in the only language, the territory had historically understood. But he held back and let her work, and when the claim was dismissed he said very simply, "You were right," and she said, "We were right," and he accepted that correction with a nod. By 1886, the Double W had grown to 14,000 acres, and Gertrude's land management consulting practice was widely known across Kansas and into the Indian Territory, where the complicated, urgent business of land documentation was becoming increasingly consequential as American settlement pressure intensified. She was careful and honest in that work, more careful than she was required to be, aware of the ways in which land documentation could be wielded to clarify or to obscure, to protect or to dispossess. She had a long conversation with Thomas Bright about this once, about what he had seen and understood about the uses of legal systems in the service of various kinds of harm, and he talked with her with a candor that she received as the trust it was, and what he said informed the standards she brought to the consulting work in ways she never articulated publicly, but never forgot. Their second child arrived in the summer of 1886, a girl they named Alina, who had August's gray-green eyes and her mother's calm precision, and who from earliest infancy seemed to be observing the world with a thorough and unhurried attention. August was besotted with her in the particular way that men who have not expected to feel such things find themselves feeling them, completely and without reservation. Howard, at 2.5, approached Alina with initial suspicion that converted quickly into a protective intensity that made Josephine laugh and say that the child would be a good foreman someday. The ranch in those years had a quality of settled rightness, not perfect, never perfect. The work was hard and the weather was uncooperative half the time and the cattle market was volatile, and the larger world was moving through changes that created constant new pressures. But there was a foundation under all of it, a foundation built from honest work and honest dealing, and a partnership between two people who had, from the beginning, refused to diminish themselves or each other. August became, gradually and without fanfare, someone different from the man who had laid that impossible contract on a saloon table in the summer of 1882. Not different in the ways that mattered, not less direct or less demanding or less committed to doing things right, but the closed quality he had carried, the thing that had made him impossible to please because pleasability requires some openness to another person's contribution, that had opened. Gertrude had not opened it by trying to please him. She had opened it by refusing to, by coming in with her own standards and her own knowledge and her own clear sense of what she was and what she was worth, and he had found that not threatening but genuinely, deeply engaging. She thought about this sometimes, about how the story of them had started with her refusal to perform the thing everyone expected her to perform. How his delight in that refusal had been the first real signal of who he actually was underneath the forbidding surface. How they had built everything from that honest beginning. In the autumn of 1887, Gertrude received an invitation from the newly formed Kansas State Historical Society to contribute a paper on land documentation practices in the territorial period. She wrote it over 2 months in the evenings, August often reading what she had written, while she read what he was drafting about the cattle industry, two people working in companionable parallel at the large table in the main room of the ranch house with the fire going and the children sleeping upstairs and the whole enormous prairie dark outside. She submitted the paper. It was published in the Society's proceedings and was cited in subsequent legal scholarship. She never made much of this publicly, but she kept a copy of the proceedings in the back room she still used as her workspace, and August had framed the title page and hung it on the wall of that room without telling her, and she found it one morning and stood looking at it for a long time. She found him later in the corrals. "You framed it," she said. "It should be framed," he said. "You might have told me." "I wanted you to find it," he said. "Was that wrong?" She considered this. "No," she said. "It was just like you. Is that a criticism?" "It is the furthest possible thing from a criticism," she said. He smiled. August Wallace's smile was not a frequent event, and it was therefore, when it occurred, of the quality of something genuinely rare, all the more itself because it was not performed or produced for effect. Their third child arrived in 1888, a boy they named James, who was, from the first day, the most sociable of the three, arriving in the world with an apparent interest in every person in the room and sustaining that interest permanently. Josephine declared him the easiest child she had ever encountered. Howard, at 4, received him with the grave authority of a person who has already established the terms and is prepared to extend them to a newcomer on a probationary basis. Eleanor, at 2, was indifferent and then abruptly devoted. The summer of 1888 was also the summer that Gertrude, in the course of her consulting work, encountered a situation involving a Chickasaw family in Indian Territory, whose land documentation had been systematically manipulated by a territorial land agent to strip them of acreage that had been formally assigned to them. The situation was deeply familiar in pattern, and deeply wrong in every dimension she understood wrong. She brought it to August, not because she needed his permission, but because it was going to require resources and legal support that exceeded her individual capacity. He read the documentation she had assembled. He was quiet for a while. "What do you need?" he said. "A lawyer in Topeka who handles territorial cases," she said, "and some of your railway contacts because the land agent is connected to a line that uses Caldwell as a depot." "The lawyer is Thomas Farrell," August said. "I've used him for the boundary work. He's good and he's honest. I'll write to him today. The railway contact is more complicated. I'll think about how to approach it." "This is not our territory," she said. "The situation is unjust, but I want to be clear that I am aware we are not the appropriate parties to lead this." "Then what are we?" he said. "We're people with resources and connections that were being asked through her to make available in support of her claim," Gertrude said. "The lead has to be hers and her family's. We're a tool, not the story." August nodded slowly. "You've thought about this carefully," he said. "It matters that we don't get it wrong," she said, "even when we're trying to do the right thing." The case took 8 months, and the full resources of Thomas Farrell's office and the railway contact that August eventually leveraged, carefully, and at some cost to a business relationship he valued. The outcome was not complete justice because complete justice was not available, but the land documentation was corrected, and the acreage that had been improperly stripped was formally restored, and Gertrude kept the letter that arrived from the family in the same drawer as her own legal documents. Years later, when Eleanor asked her about that letter, Gertrude would say that it represented the most important work she had ever done with her legal skills. And Eleanor, who was by then 12 and already developing her mother's precision of thought, would ask why that one and not the county recording system or the published paper, and Gertrude would say, "Because those helped the system work better. This one corrected what the system had done wrong." Eleanor thought about this for several days and came back and said, "Isn't making the system work better also correcting what it does wrong, just in advance?" And Gertrude looked at her daughter and felt the specific pride of a teacher whose student has surpassed the lesson. The Double W continued to grow and adapt through the late 1880s and into the 1890s, navigating the changes that were reshaping the entire cattle industry. The great drives were ending as the railways expanded, and the ranges were being fenced, and the open range era, which had been violent and magnificent and deeply complicated in its relationship to the land, and the people who had lived on it, was closing. August understood this earlier than many of his peers and made adjustments in the ranch's operations that protected its economic position through the transition, moving the Double W toward a more diversified model that included horse breeding and grain farming alongside the cattle operation. Gertrude's role shifted with the ranch. The bookkeeping had long since been expanded into a full administrative function that included the management of multiple contracts, the oversight of several employees, and the financial planning that gave the ranch its stability. She had also, by the early 1890s, begun formally training young women from Caldwell and surrounding areas in bookkeeping and land documentation, working with the county school board to develop a curriculum that gave women entering the workforce the tools that had taken her years of informal education to acquire. This was, in many ways, the thing she was most proud of. Not the formal accomplishments, though she valued those. Not the consulting practice, or the published paper, or the county recording system. The young women who left her training with skills that gave them choices. That was the work that felt, when she thought about it in the evenings of her life, like the best investment of what she had been given. August watched her teach once, sitting at the back of the room in the Caldwell schoolhouse where she held her Saturday sessions, and afterward he said nothing for a while and then said, "You're very good at this," and she said, "I had a good example," and he said, "Bernard Oakes." And she said, "My mother," and then, after a pause, "And you." And he looked at her with a surprise that was genuine and then a softness that was complete. And she took his hand in the empty schoolhouse with the afternoon light coming through the windows in long golden bars and held it for a moment, simply and without words. In 1892, Howard was 8 and Eleanor was 6 and James was 4. And the ranch house had the particular sound quality of a house with children in it, noise and motion and abrupt, complete silence when everyone was asleep. August had built a proper addition to the house when James arrived, a bedroom and a study, and the study had become, over time, a shared space where he and Gertrude both worked in the evenings. And it had the quality that their shared spaces always had, the presence of two particular people who fit together without sacrificing the particular shape of either one of them. Thomas Bright had married a woman named Ada in 1885, and they had 3 children of their own, and lived on the Double W on a plot that August had formally deeded to them in 1887, which had been a legal and social act of some complexity in Comanche County, and one that he had done without comment and with complete determination. Josephine had returned to her own family in Wichita in 1890, missed by everyone, replaced by a young couple from Caldwell, named the Grahams, who were good and became, over time, part of the ranch's fabric in the way that the people who share your daily life become part of it. The seasons moved and the work continued, and the children grew into themselves with the particular inevitability of children who have been truly seen and genuinely loved, becoming their own people rather than versions of their parents. Howard at 10 had August's directness and his mother's analytical instinct, and had decided with great conviction that he was going to be an engineer, which delighted Gertrude and puzzled August until Howard explained his reasoning in such complete detail that August said, "That is an excellent argument," and began to think about how to support it. Eleanor at 8 was already keeping a journal of observations about the ranch's operations that she had not told either of her parents about, which Gertrude found by accident and read, with a growing astonishment that resolved into the conviction that her daughter had a scholarly mind of real quality. James, perennial diplomat and social architect of the 3, was primarily concerned with ensuring that everyone in his orbit was engaged and happy, which was its own kind of intelligence. The evening of Gertrude and August's 10th wedding anniversary in June of 1893, the ranch was very quiet. The children were asleep. The Grahams had retired to their cottage. The summer night was warm and very still, and the sky was doing its best work, that measureless deep blue-black that existed only far from any settlement, full of stars in a quantity that the human eye never entirely adjusts to. They sat on the porch of the house that had been built by his father and rebuilt and extended and made into something larger and more permanent by their life together, and the prairie stretched out around them in every direction, and the Double W was 11 years into her management of its accounts, and 10 years into their marriage and 7 years into their family, and all of that was present in the quiet around them. Do you remember the saloon? August said. The contract, she said. The expression on your face when you put it back on the table, he said. I had no idea what to do with it. You were delighted, she said. I was, he said. I didn't understand why immediately. I thought it was just the novelty. I didn't know then that it was going to be the thing that changed everything. Your refusal to be pleased by performance, she said. And your refusal to perform, he said. You were the first person who came to this ranch without trying to earn my approval, and I didn't understand until much later that I had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly that. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the night sounds, the insects and the distant cattle and the wind moving through the grass. I was told you were impossible to please, she said. You were, he agreed. Everyone said so. I didn't come to please you, she said. I know, he said. That is why I was pleased. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, in the moonlight with 10 years of everything between them, and his expression had the quality it always had in private, completely open, nothing held back or protected. I love you, he said. I love you, she said. It was a simple exchange, simply meant, and it rested in the warm night air with the same rightness as all the other things they had built together. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the stars turned very slowly overhead, and the prairie was immense and dark, and full of the sounds of living things. In the years that followed that 10th anniversary, the Wallace family continued to make their life on the Double W with the same essential quality that had characterized it from the beginning, honestly and well. Howard did become an engineer, leaving for the University of Kansas in 1901, and coming back to Comanche County 3 years later as a man with technical expertise that he applied, among other things, to the water management systems of the ranch. Eleanor went east to study at the Kansas State Normal School at Emporia as her mother had, and unlike her mother, she was able to complete her studies and took a position as a teacher in Lawrence, before eventually returning to Caldwell and contributing to the exact educational program that Gertrude had established. James stayed on the Double W and proved to be, as Josephine had predicted in his infancy, an excellent manager, with a gift for the human side of operations that complemented his father's technical precision beautifully. August's hair went gray in his mid-50s, and he carried it the way he carried everything else, without vanity and without complaint, simply as a fact of living. He remained direct and demanding and genuinely excellent at what he did, and the quality of him that Gertrude had identified in the beginning, that bone-deep coherence of being completely himself, never diminished. If anything, it deepened, became more settled and more generous as the hard years of building and proving gave way to the years of maintaining and sharing. Gertrude's work transformed the county's land documentation practices permanently. The recording system she designed was still in use 40 years later. The young women she trained went on to professional careers across Kansas and into the surrounding territories, and several of them named their practices and their methodologies after her, which she received with the same slight impatience she brought to all formal recognition, pleased but more interested in the work than in the acknowledgement. She was 63 in the winter of 1919 when she sat down to compile the history of the Double W's administrative development that August had been asking her to write for years, not as a personal memoir but as a professional document, a record of how a ranch of this size was actually run, the accounting and legal methodologies, the land management practices, the principles that had governed decisions. She wrote it in the study that had always been their shared space, at the large desk that had replaced the original table over the years, and August sat in the chair across from her in the evenings and read what she had written and occasionally said, "That's right," or "You've left out the part about the 1885 water dispute," and she would look up and say, "I was getting to it," and he would say, "I know," and the exchange was so deeply familiar and so easy that it was like breathing, unconscious and sustaining. The document was completed in the spring of 1920, and was submitted to the Kansas State Historical Society, which had been asking for exactly this kind of operational history, and received it with the seriousness it deserved. On the day she finished the final page, Gertrude Merritt Wallace set down her pen and looked out the window of the study at the double W spread before her, the corrals and the outbuildings and the land reaching away in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in Caldwell in the summer of 1882 with her traveling bags and her carpetbag full of ledger books and the clear, quiet certainty that she was the best bookkeeper and land recorder within 300 miles and deserved to be paid accordingly. She had been right about that. She had been right about quite a lot of things, and the things she had been wrong about she had learned from, and the life she had built from all of it was, taken whole, exactly what she had wanted when she had not quite known yet what she wanted. August came in from the corrals in the late afternoon and found her at her desk, not working but sitting, which was unusual enough that he looked at her with the particular attention he had always brought to unusual things. "Finished," he said. "Yes," she said. He came to stand beside her and looked at the last page she had written, and then at the window and then at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Very all right," she said. "I was thinking about 1882. The contract," he said, as he always did. "The contract," she agreed. "And the woman who put it back on the table. She was remarkable," he said. "She was exactly herself," Gertrude said. "That was all." He pulled the second chair up to her desk and sat beside her in the late afternoon light. And outside the window the Kansas sky was doing its evening work, the colors going through gold to amber to the deep rose that only existed at this latitude and this hour. And the double W was very still around them with the particular piece of a place that has been well loved and well tended. And August Wallace and Gertrude Merritt Wallace sat together in the quiet of everything they had made. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole world, and it was good.